Christmas morning arrived quietly in the town of Elm Ridge. There was no snowfall, no dramatic weather to announce that something was about to go wrong. The streets were calm, decorated with soft yellow lights still glowing from the night before. Wrapping paper sat in bins at the edge of driveways. The smell of coffee and pine drifted from warm kitchens. It was the kind of morning people trusted. At 6:17 a.m., that trust shattered. The call came into dispatch without panic, without screaming, without urgency in the voice. That alone unsettled the operator. Most emergency calls carried chaos with them. Breathless words, overlapping sentences, fear leaking through the line. This one didn't. The caller spoke clearly. "I need someone to come to the house," the voice said. "Something's wrong." The operator asked what kind of emergency it was. There was a pause. Not long, just long enough to register. "My husband isn't responding," the caller said, "and I think he's dead." The address was given calmly, too calmly. Patrol units were dispatched immediately. Christmas morning or not, protocol didn't pause for holidays. Officers in Elm Ridge were already moving between routine calls, welfare checks, noise complaints from late-night gatherings that had lasted too long. This one felt different before anyone arrived. When Officer Daniel Mercer pulled up to the house, the neighborhood looked untouched. No flashing lights from other units yet, no neighbors outside, just a two-story home with a wreath still hanging crookedly on the front door. The door was unlocked. Inside, the house was warm. Christmas music played softly from somewhere in the back, still looping from the night before. The tree stood fully lit, presents opened and scattered beneath it. Nothing appeared disturbed. No sign of struggle, no broken glass, no overturned furniture. The woman who had made the call stood near the hallway, arms folded tightly across her chest. Her name was Karen Holt. She was barefoot, still in her pajamas. Her hair looked brushed, not hurried. Her eyes were dry. She pointed toward the bedroom without speaking. Officer Mercer entered slowly. The body lay on the bed, positioned neatly beneath the comforter. Michael Holt, 46 years old, appeared as though he were sleeping. No visible injuries, no blood, no discoloration beyond the pale stillness that comes when life has already left. Time of death was unclear. The room smelled faintly of aftershave and something else, something sharp beneath the warmth of the house. Mercer couldn't place it immediately. It wasn't decay, it wasn't smoke, it was chemical. Backup arrived within minutes, then paramedics, then detectives. Karen Holt sat at the kitchen table while questions were asked. She answered all of them. Her voice never wavered. She said she woke up early, as she always did on Christmas morning. She said Michael hadn't stirred. She said she tried shaking him, then calling his name. She said she knew immediately something was wrong. When asked why she didn't attempt CPR, she said she didn't think it would help. That answer lingered. The medical examiner arrived shortly after. He noted the lack of trauma, no immediate signs of cardiac arrest either. Michael Holt had no known heart conditions. He was healthy, active. According to Karen, he'd been perfectly fine the night before. Dinner had been quiet, normal, just the two of them, no guests, no alcohol beyond a single glass of wine each. They'd exchanged gifts, watched television, gone to bed early. Normal. The word appeared again and again in the report. But Christmas crimes rarely look abnormal at first. As the body was prepared for transport, one of the paramedics noticed something unusual, faint redness around Michael's lips, subtle, easy to miss. Combined with the smell Mercer had noticed earlier, it prompted a quiet conversation near the doorway. The house was sealed for further investigation. Karen was informed she could not return inside. She nodded. Outside, neighbors had begun to gather, pulled from their homes by police presence in whispers traveling faster than facts. Karen stood alone on the porch, wrapped in a blanket provided by an officer. She did not cry. She did not ask questions. Detective Laura Jennings arrived just after 9 a.m. She had been with her own family when the call came in. She left half-open gifts on the floor, a mug of coffee cooling on the counter. Some cases announced themselves immediately. This one had done so quietly, and those were often the ones that never let go. Jennings reviewed the scene, the statements, the initial observations. The absence of violence concerned her more than its presence would have. Death without disorder demanded explanation. She spoke with Karen alone. Karen described her marriage reminder by reminder, 15 years together, no major issues, minor arguments, nothing more. She said Michael had been stressed at work recently, but seemed relieved that the holidays had arrived. Jennings asked about medications. She listed them easily. None belonged to Michael. Jennings asked about arguments. Karen smiled faintly. "Everyone argues," she said, "but nothing that would lead to this." Jennings did not respond, because in her experience, the most devastating crimes were rarely born from loud arguments. They came from quiet resentments, rehearsed thoughts, decisions made long before action followed. The autopsy would take time, toxicology even longer. Karen Holt was allowed to leave with family later that afternoon. Christmas continued around her. People returned to their dinners, children played with new toys. The town tried to resume the day it had planned. But inside the Holt house, something irreversible had already happened. The call that came on Christmas morning did more than report a death. It opened a case that would expose truths no one in Elm Ridge was prepared to face, about trust, about silence, and about how easily love can become the most convincing disguise of all. By the afternoon of Christmas Day, the Holt house no longer felt like a home. Yellow tape stretched across the front yard, fluttering slightly in the cold breeze. The wreath still hung on the door, its red bow bright against the neutral siding, an unintentional mockery of the scene unfolding behind it. Neighbors passed slowly, pretending not to stare, pretending not to listen to the low murmur of officers and investigators moving in and out. Detective Laura Jennings stood in the living room, absorbing the quiet. Crime scenes often carried noise with them, shattered objects, raised voices frozen mid-argument, visible signs of chaos. This one carried restraint. Everything was where it belonged. The tree lights still blinked softly. The television remained paused on a holiday movie. 2 wine glasses sat in the sink, rinsed but not washed. Someone had been careful. Jennings walked toward the kitchen, pulling on gloves. She examined the counter, the trash, the recycling bin. Wrapping paper from the night before had been neatly folded and stacked, not crumpled. Plates had been cleaned. The meal had been deliberate, organized. She paused at the spice rack. Several bottles were missing from their usual places, not gone entirely, just relocated. One sat near the back of a cabinet, slightly out of alignment. Another rested on a high shelf that required a step stool to reach. People moved things when they didn't want them seen. The medical examiner's preliminary findings arrived just after 3 p.m. No sign of heart attack, no stroke, no aneurysm. Cause of death? Undetermined pending toxicology. But there were indicators. The faint redness around Michael Holt's mouth was not incidental. It suggested exposure to a substance that irritated tissue. Combined with the subtle chemical odor reported by first responders, it pointed toward ingestion rather than injection or inhalation. Poison. Not all poisons worked quickly. Some mimicked natural failure. Some left the body intact while shutting it down internally. Jennings returned to Karen Holt's statement. Karen had described Christmas Eve as calm, quiet, predictable. Dinner at home, no visitors, no late-night activity. She said Michael went to bed around 10:30. She said she followed shortly after. She said she slept through the night. No disturbances, no gasping, no coughing. That was unusual. Most toxins that cause death left traces of distress, some visible, some audible, yet Karen reported none of it. Jennings requested phone records. Karen's phone showed minimal activity after 9 p.m., a few text messages exchanged earlier in the evening, none afterward, no late-night calls, no searches, no frantic activity. Again, restraint. Michael's phone was more interesting. At 11:47 p.m., he had attempted to unlock it, failed, then again at 11:49, then silence. 2 failed attempts suggested impairment. By midnight, Michael Holt was likely already dying. Jennings revisited the bedroom. The bed was made loosely but not hastily. The comforter lay evenly, no sign of thrashing. The pillow beneath Michael's head showed no discoloration, no fluids. His hands rested near his sides. Death had come quietly, too quietly. The medical examiner called the next morning. Preliminary screens showed ethylene glycol, antifreeze, colorless, sweet-tasting, deadly. It caused organ failure, shutting down the kidneys and central nervous system over several hours. Early symptoms included dizziness, nausea, confusion. Later stages brought unconsciousness and respiratory failure. It fit the timeline perfectly. Jennings felt the weight of it settle in her chest. Ethylene glycol didn't appear accidentally. Someone had introduced it. The question was when and how. Karen Holt was brought back in for a second interview. This time, the tone shifted. Jennings sat across from her in a small interview room, the fluorescent lights flattening everything. Karen looked the same, calm, composed, cooperative, but there was a tightness now around her mouth, a slight impatience in her posture. Jennings asked again about Christmas Eve. Karen repeated her story nearly word for word. That consistency would have impressed a jury. It did not impress a detective. When Jennings mentioned antifreeze, Karen's eyes flickered, just briefly. She said, "I don't know anything about that. We don't even keep antifreeze inside the house." Jennings already knew that. One said true. A half-empty container had been found in the garage, tucked behind storage bins, recently opened, the cap not fully tightened. Jennings asked Karen when the last time she'd been in the garage was. Karen hesitated. "I don't remember. Maybe earlier in the week." Earlier in the week didn't explain fresh residue on the container's rim. It also didn't explain why the bottle had been moved from its usual shelf. Jennings leaned back. "Karen," she said quietly, "people don't usually poison someone by accident." Karen's composure cracked, not into tears, but into irritation. "You're talking like I did this." Jennings didn't deny it. Instead, she asked about Michael's insurance. Karen answered easily. Life insurance, workplace benefits, a policy large enough to cover debts and provide long-term stability. She asked about marriage troubles. Karen sighed. "Every marriage has problems," she said again, "but nothing worth killing over." Jennings thought about that sentence later, because the people who committed these crimes rarely believed their reasons were worth killing over until they were. Evidence began stacking quietly. Antifreeze traces were found in one of the wine glasses, the one Karen claimed she hadn't used. The dishwasher cycle had not reached a temperature high enough to remove all residue. Neighbors reported nothing unusual, no visitors, no arguments. But one neighbor mentioned seeing Karen awake late past midnight. Karen said she went to bed early. That was the first visible fracture. As night fell on the second day of the investigation, Jennings sat alone in her office reviewing photographs. The tree, the wine glasses, the garage shelf, the phone logs. This case wasn't loud. It wasn't messy. It was intimate. Someone had planned this death around tradition, trust, and timing, around the expectation that Christmas morning deaths would be met with sympathy, not suspicion. They had counted on love as camouflage. Jennings closed the file and stared at the window. Outside, holiday lights still glowed faintly across the city. Inside, a case was taking shape, one that would dismantle a life carefully constructed to appear harmless. And the call that came on Christmas morning was only the beginning. The investigation deepened as the town of Elmridge slowly returned to normal routines. Streets were cleared, children played with toys, and families resumed holiday traditions. But inside the Holt household, life had fractured completely. The walls that had once held comfort now carried tension, suspicion, and the lingering question, why? Detective Laura Jennings spent long hours piecing together every detail of Michael Holt's final day alive. Surveillance footage from nearby streets confirmed what officers had already suspected. No visitors had arrived, no unusual activity had been observed from outside. The timeline reinforced Karen's story, but only partially. Karen's composure remained unnervingly consistent during interviews. She recounted the evening as if reading from a script. Dinner, wine, soft conversation, lights out. Yet every forensic detail subtly contradicted her narrative. The presence of ethylene glycol in a wine glass, the partially moved antifreeze container in the garage, the timestamps on Michael's phone, the observations from neighbors noting lights late into the night. Jennings began to see a pattern that was more deliberate than chaotic, a calculated orchestration disguised as domestic normalcy. The focus turned to motive. Karen's financial situation was complex. Michael had been the primary earner, handling the mortgage, investments, and a high-yield retirement plan. Karen had access to the accounts at home, but Michael's control over joint investments had been strict, a fact she mentioned repeatedly during interviews. Insurance was another piece of the puzzle. Michael's policy alone exceeded $500,000, enough to settle debts, provide for the children, and ensure a comfortable future. Jennings knew from experience that financial opportunity rarely remained untapped in crimes that looked accidental. Then came the detail that finally tipped suspicion into certainty. Karen had revised her own will just 3 weeks prior, increasing her share of the estate and altering provisions related to life insurance payout. Notably, she did not inform Michael. Records showed she had done so quietly through her attorney, who confirmed the paperwork was processed with urgency. The pieces began forming a picture. The death wasn't spontaneous, it was strategically timed. By cross-referencing Karen's statements with forensic evidence, Jennings realized that Michael's wine the night before had been the most likely vector. Small amounts of ethylene glycol, sweet-tasting, colorless, added with care. The autopsy indicated consumption hours before his death. The glass, still on the counter when police arrived, was rinsed lightly, just enough to suggest use without drawing suspicion. Jennings revisited the garage. The antifreeze container was almost clean, only faint traces remained. Whoever had handled it knew what they were doing, had considered cleanup, and had relied on normal routines to mask the act. The poison was subtle, the movements quiet, invisible to anyone who assumed Christmas morning would remain ordinary. Next came interviews with family friends and colleagues. No arguments had been reported, but minor complaints about Michael's strict oversight at work and at home surfaced. Several co-workers mentioned that Karen had recently expressed frustration over financial dependence. Jennings logged the testimonies carefully. They painted a psychological portrait rather than a physical one. A woman accustomed to control but constrained, watching opportunity slip under a veneer of marital normalcy.
Then the final confirmation came from a small, overlooked piece of evidence, Michael's personal journal. Investigators discovered notes indicating he suspected someone close to him was tampering with his wine. There were references to minor irritations, an unbalanced cup here, a misplaced object there, but nothing that indicated direct fear. Still, the entries matched the forensic timeline. Someone had used the domestic routine against him. Jennings interviewed Karen again. She pressed gently, framing questions around Christmas routines rather than confrontation. "Did Michael drink wine that evening?" she asked. "Yes," Karen said. "We always have a small glass after dinner. He liked it." "Did you pour it?" Karen hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward the kitchen in a subtle, almost imperceptible motion, then back. "No," she said. "He poured his own." Jennings didn't press, not yet. Every careful statement, every minor detail, every time Karen mentioned normalcy became a thread connecting her to opportunity. She had access, knowledge of the schedule, control over the environment. Jennings noted how the timing was perfect. A holiday morning, minimal disruption, likely delayed response if Michael had become sick overnight. Forensics revealed the ethylene glycol level in Michael's system was consistent with ingestion hours before his death. This aligned with Karen's story only superficially. Her claim that she slept normally was now questionable, and every precise action she described added to the timeline of premeditation. The detective's office became a map of subtle manipulation. Glass in the sink, wine poured, antifreeze container moved, journals noting slight inconsistencies, phone logs showing Michael awake and trying unsuccessfully to access his device. Every detail suggested someone had orchestrated the night to appear ordinary while plotting the most extraordinary breach of trust imaginable. By evening, Jennings had concluded the initial assessment. This case would not be resolved with eyewitness testimony alone. The crime was designed to exploit routine, to leverage habit and trust as a shield. Karen Holt was present, consistent in demeanor, but every action and every omission pointed toward deliberate orchestration. The detective's office reviewed Karen's previous statements. Minor inconsistencies emerged, almost imperceptible. The claim that she went to bed before 11 p.m. conflicted with neighbor observations and phone metadata. Small delays in reporting symptoms of distress in Michael suggested awareness, not ignorance. And crucially, no outside party could have intervened. The scene was carefully contained within the home, using Christmas morning's normalcy as a mask. As night fell on the second day, Jennings sat alone at her desk. She reviewed the timeline once more, aligning forensic evidence with statements and neighbor accounts. She realized this was more than murder by poison. It was a calculated exercise in deception, a crime that relied not on strength or force, but on meticulous timing, psychological insight, and manipulation of trust. The call that had come on Christmas morning was just the surface. Beneath it lay the premeditation, the planning, the quiet orchestration of a murder disguised as routine. Jennings closed the files for the night. Outside, Elmridge slept in the holiday calm, unaware that its quiet streets had borne witness to something that would change every assumption about domestic safety, trust, and the danger lurking behind polite, composed exteriors. Because in some homes, the most peaceful Christmas mornings hold the darkest secrets. By the fourth day after Michael Holt's death, the town of Elmridge seemed to breathe normally again. Stores opened, traffic moved, and holiday music played faintly on repeat from radios and speakers. Life had resumed its rhythm outside, but inside the detective's office, every detail of that morning refused to settle. Detective Laura Jennings reviewed the evidence with a growing sense of urgency. The ethylene glycol found in Michael's system, combined with its timing, painted a picture of meticulous planning. Poisoning someone at home, in a domestic setting, required patience and understanding of routines. Someone had calculated the hours, the environment, and the reactions of others.
Karen Holt's composure began to show cracks under questioning. During her second formal interview, subtle inconsistencies emerged. Initially, she insisted she went to bed at 10:30 p.m. Christmas Eve, yet the phone records indicated activity from her device as late as 11:50 p.m., long after she claimed to be asleep. Text messages sent and received during that period conflicted with her statements. Jennings noted how carefully Karen phrased every sentence. Words like "I think," "I don't remember," and "perhaps" filled her testimony, giving the illusion of honesty while hiding definitive details. Every carefully crafted phrase was meant to mask the truth. Detective colleagues were assigned to trace Karen's movements that evening. They reconstructed her steps using camera footage from nearby streets, neighbor accounts, and her own statements. The findings were subtle but damning. She had left a window slightly open in the kitchen. She had touched the wine glasses at precise intervals. She had accessed the garage briefly, the same space where the antifreeze container had been moved. Small details, seemingly meaningless, were aligning perfectly with the timeline of Michael's poisoning. The next breakthrough came from the medical examiner. Toxicology results confirmed the dose of ethylene glycol was carefully measured, lethal but slow-acting, ensuring death appeared natural if not investigated. The chemical had been introduced gradually, possibly diluted in wine or another beverage Michael regularly consumed. Its effects, confusion, dizziness, and eventual organ failure, matched the late-night timeline exactly. Karen was summoned again. This time, Jennings employed a new approach. Rather than accuse, she presented facts as observations. "We know Michael tried to unlock his phone at 11:47 p.m. We know someone had access to his wine shortly before that. We know the antifreeze bottle was moved from its usual spot. We also know there were no other visitors, no unusual activity reported by neighbors. Can you help explain any of this?" Karen blinked rapidly. She hesitated, shifting in her chair. I don't know," she whispered. "Maybe I was distracted. I did check something in the garage, yes, but only to get wrapping paper, that's all. I don't understand." Her voice faltered, a rare break in her careful composure. Jennings recognized it immediately. This was the first visible crack in her alibi. Detectives turned their attention to forensic confirmation. They retested the wine glasses, the dishwasher residue, and the surfaces Karen had handled. Each sample reinforced the same conclusion. Karen had opportunity, knowledge, and access. The cumulative evidence suggested not negligence, not accident, but intentionality. Neighbors were re-interviewed. One elderly couple who had initially reported nothing unusual recalled faintly that they heard the kitchen light flick on just after 11:30 p.m., a time Karen claimed to be asleep. Another neighbor mentioned seeing a shadow move past the front window at approximately the same time. Individually, these observations were minor, but together they chipped away at the narrative Karen had constructed. Jennings began to see a pattern of psychological manipulation. Karen had relied on two things: the expectation that Christmas would mask suspicion and the belief that her composure would convince investigators. Her calm had been her shield, but calm could only last so long under the pressure of corroborating evidence. During the next interview, Jennings introduced another element: Michael's insurance policy. She said, "Michael's life insurance will pay out a substantial sum. Can you explain your interest in accessing it before his death?" Karen's reaction was instantaneous. She tensed, lips tightening. "It's just practical," she said. "We need to pay bills, manage expenses." Jennings pressed gently. "You changed your will recently, correct? Increased your share?" Karen's eyes flickered downward. I thought it was routine, legal planning, nothing more." Yet the combination of financial motive, access to lethal chemicals, and inconsistencies in her statements was now forming a cohesive picture of premeditation. For the first time, Jennings felt the investigation pivot from circumstantial suspicion to something more concrete. The calm demeanor, the careful planning, the timing, all pointed to a deliberate act designed to appear accidental. Karen Holt's alibi was collapsing under the weight of forensic science, witness observation, and behavioral analysis.
By the evening, the team had reconstructed the night with minute precision. Karen had handled the wine glasses, checked the garage, moved objects to facilitate her plan, and retired to her bedroom in a manner that suggested no one could detect her actions. The final steps, Michael consuming the poison, attempting to unlock his phone, and succumbing to its effects, had all occurred while Karen maintained her composed narrative. The accumulation of evidence prompted Jennings to make a decision. Arrest warrants were drafted for Karen Holt. It was no longer a question of suspicion, it was a question of proof. Before serving the warrant, Jennings met privately with her team. This isn't loud, messy, or violent. It's quiet, domestic, and controlled. That's why it's dangerous. Every small detail matters because every small detail will convict her. That night, Karen Holt was taken into custody. She walked calmly, almost predictably, through the front door of her home, past the yellow tape, past neighbors whispering. Her composure was still present, but Jennings knew calm doesn't survive forensic evidence. In her statement at the station, Karen initially claimed ignorance. She denied knowledge of the ethylene glycol, the timing, and any intent to harm Michael. But the investigative team had more than statements. They had chemical proof, timeline reconstruction, and witness corroboration. Karen's alibi was no longer sufficient. The calm she had relied on, the narrative she had rehearsed in her mind, had finally begun to crumble. The town of Elmridge faced a stark realization. The perfect crime disguised in holiday normalcy was unraveling, and Christmas morning would no longer feel innocent in the minds of those who knew the Holts.
By the time Karen Holt's trial began, the festive season had faded entirely from Elmridge. Snow had melted, leaving damp streets and gray skies. Yet for the residents, the shadow of Christmas morning lingered like a chill that refused to dissipate. Inside the courthouse, all traces of holiday cheer were absent. The proceedings were stark, sterile, and heavy with anticipation. The prosecution opened with a straightforward statement. "This case," the attorney said, "is not about a holiday. It is about choice, deception, and betrayal." They presented evidence meticulously. Surveillance footage from neighboring streets confirmed Karen's movements during the night. Toxicology reports detailed ethylene glycol levels consistent with a lethal, intentional dose. Phone metadata and witness observations aligned with forensic reconstructions. Each detail painted a picture of premeditation disguised as domestic normalcy. Karen's defense attempted to shift the narrative toward emotional instability. They emphasized marital strain, frustration over financial dependence, and psychological stress. They argued she had acted impulsively, that the poisoning was not calculated, but born from panic and confusion. They described a woman overwhelmed, not murderous. But the prosecution countered with precision. They highlighted her calm composure, the careful handling of the wine glasses, and the timing of the poison. They emphasized how she had manipulated perception, using Christmas morning, a time when tragedy would elicit sympathy, to mask her intentions. Every step, every detail had been deliberate. The courtroom absorbed this methodical recounting with tense silence. Detective Laura Jennings was called to testify. She described the scene, the subtle irregularities, and the forensic findings. She spoke of the quiet planning evident in every object, every action, every minor misstep. "What struck me most," Jennings explained, "was how ordinary everything seemed. The house looked peaceful, the morning routine uninterrupted, but the evidence told a different story. Opportunity, access, knowledge, all converged that night. This wasn't accidental, it was orchestrated." Karen maintained composure for much of the testimony, but subtle signs of strain appeared. Tightened jaw, brief hesitation, an occasional blink that seemed to betray the careful mask she had worn. Family members of Michael Holt attended court quietly, their grief tempered by the need to witness justice. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues filled the courtroom, many in disbelief that a holiday morning could conceal such malice. Their murmurs were restrained, but their presence underscored the community impact of a crime so personal, so intimate, yet executed with calculated invisibility. The defense rested after emphasizing emotional stress, lack of intent, and the challenges of psychological interpretation. They pleaded for leniency, hoping the jury would see human frailty rather than criminal deliberation. During deliberation, the jury considered evidence that extended far beyond testimony. Chemical analysis, phone records, witness accounts, and behavioral patterns all contributed to a narrative that could not be ignored. Karen's calm, once a protective shield, had become the strongest indicator of premeditation. After 2 days, the jury returned. Karen Holt was found guilty of second-degree murder. The verdict was delivered quietly, without fanfare, yet its weight was undeniable. Karen's reaction was measured. She lowered her head, exhaled, and allowed the reality to settle. She did not scream, she did not faint, she did not protest. Instead, she remained composed, perhaps the same trait that had aided her in committing the crime, now helping her face the consequences. During sentencing, the judge highlighted the gravity of the betrayal. This crime, he said, was executed in a place of trust. It took advantage of routine, of familiarity, of love. The method was subtle, the timing precise, and the deception deliberate. The sentence reflects the severity of violating the sanctity of home and family. Karen received a lengthy prison term. Though no physical struggle had occurred, the emotional and psychological violence inflicted by her actions ensured the sentence was significant. The aftermath in Elmridge was quieter, slower to return to normal than anyone expected. The community processed grief, betrayal, and shock. Christmases to come carried a shadow, the knowledge that behind closed doors, even familiar routines could conceal danger. Detective Jennings reflected on the case long after the courtroom emptied. The call that came on Christmas morning seemed ordinary at first, yet its consequences rippled through families, the justice system, and the detective herself. She realized the case was more than a murder investigation. It was a study of human behavior, a cautionary tale of trust and deception, and a stark reminder that the quietest moments often hide the darkest intentions. In the years that followed, the Holt home was sold. New occupants moved in, unaware of the events that had unfolded behind its walls. The tree ornaments, the wine glasses, the small domestic details, nothing in appearance betrayed the past. But Jennings knew better. Crimes like this do not vanish with a change of ownership. They linger in the evidence, in the memories, and in the lessons left for those who investigate them. And for Karen Holt, Christmas morning would forever remain the day her choices changed everything, not just for her family, but for an entire town that had trusted the sanctity of routine and the calm of the holidays. Because in Elmridge, the quietest holiday morning revealed a truth that would not be forgotten. Trust, when violated, leaves scars far deeper than any visible wound. The snow may have melted, the lights dimmed, and the holidays passed, but the shadow of that Christmas morning and the crime hidden within it would remain, always.